Hello and welcome to an AAIS webinar. I am Chris Offenthy, Director of Regulatory Filings here at AIS. Today we'll be taking a look at advancing AI in insurance, navigating the regulatory trends. Today I'm joined by Anthony Habib, co-founder and CEO of Monitaur, Mary Block, Director of Insurance Regulation at the Insurance Department of Financial Regulation. And together we're going to be discussing trends in AI adoption, practical steps to align with the NAIC Bulletin, and strategies to ensure transparency and explainability for regulators and consumers. Anthony, Mary, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Great to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get going, just a quick reminder to our audience that we want to encourage engagement as much as possible throughout our discussion today. To ensure this, you can submit some questions in the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye out and try to address questions as they come up. If we don't get to them, we'll do our best to address them at the end of the discussion today when we conclude. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick some things off. Quick introduction of our panelist. Anthony, Mary, can you briefly share your background and what kind of drove you to insurance, and particularly why AI is interesting to you? Anthony, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, you bet. So I'm Anthony Habib. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Monitaur, and we're an AI governance solution for the insurance industry. Started the company in 2019, way before we were talking about AI risk and governance, and very much motivated by, I think AI can make our lives better. And, our whole company believes that within the insurance industry, there's the opportunity to have AI improve pricing and underwriting and claims, bringing money into people's hands at the moments that they need it most, providing insurance in places that it might not be available today, offering better insurance in places where historical actuarial data is difficult to predict the future. So we think that AI can be a positive change agent if it's governed responsibly. And so we've tried to build a company that helps customers in the insurance industry to really build and manage a governance program that both aligns with regulatory expectations, but also helps to achieve better outcomes and business objectives for clients. So it's great to be here today to get to talk about some of these issues.
Mary, how about you share a little bit of your background and again, why nobody really grows up and says, hey, I want to get and join insurance. Maybe you can, what drove you to insurance? What drove you to AI in particular, or just technology, I guess?
I did not fantasize about being in the insurance business as a child. No, I admit it. My name is Mary Block. I'm the Director of Insurance Regulation at the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation. So I've been with the department about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was in the industry. So I came from the life and health industry, life, annuity, disability, and long-term care industry. Prior to that, I was in the financial services industry. So I started on the security side with a little bit of insurance and went to the insurance side with some securities, but it has spent about 35 years in the industry. So I have an incredibly helpful degree in sociology, and honestly don't know how I wound up in this industry. Yeah, I became an attorney later in life, and just I loved it when I joined it, and so that's how I wound up here. I started being interested in AI as an attorney while I was in the industry because I worked for a company that was beginning their journey, right? To use data, to use AI, to use accelerated underwriting and things like that. And so, I had to provide advice. And in order to do that, I had to understand it. And so that obviously curiosity killed the cat, but I loved it. And have brought it with me all the way into my regulatory career.
Very interesting. Very cool. So let me ask you guys this question. Why is AI such a hot topic right now in the insurance industry? I mean, Anthony, you started off like in 2019, nobody was really discussing it. Why now? Like, is it just the nature of the beast as a whole, or is there anything in particular about the insurance industry, why this is becoming such a hot and transformative topic?
Yeah, for sure. And, Chris, it's also great to share this sort of panel with you because I think you've got your own great journey of having been on the regulatory side, and now you're in industry and you were dealing with filings today, and you also reviewed filings before. So excited to sort of have you opine in on some of this stuff too. I mean, listen, sometimes AI is overplayed. Like sometimes we use that phrase too generously. Insurance has been building models for a really long time. right? So a lot of what we might call AI in insurance, we could argue is sort of business as usual in insurance. We've been building predictive models for a while, right? What I think has really happened in the last few years in particular is, once we got into a world where GPT and generative happened, you now had non-technical people, non-actuaries, business leaders saying, I want to build a model to do this thing. I'm going to use AI to do this thing, right? We're not talking about agentic AI. And it sort of brought modeling into the kitchen table, right? Like I remember my mom calling me one day and saying, hey, I just did this thing on GPT. Do you know what that is? And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening here, right? So I think that, for the insurance industry, AI is in insurance context specifically, it's a new modeling paradigm in technology that has some new challenges, but some also very familiar things that need to be managed to try and bring our industry forward. In a broader landscape, I would say that, to a lot of folks, AI is Gen AI and large language models and GPT in a very sort of consumer-centric way. I think within this industry that is very low margin, a lot of manual touches and processes and workflows, the opportunity to create better efficiencies and transparency and products is, as I look across all the industries that AI could impact, insurance might be one of the most meaningful places where AI can have a positive impact because of new modeling techniques. And so I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess it's fair. I should probably give the folks on our call just a quick background of mine. I actually am one of those people who grew up in insurance. I had a grandfather who was an agent. I have two uncles who are still agents in the insurance background. That was the path I wanted to go towards. That fortunately did not work for me, so I ended up starting working at the North Dakota State Insurance Department, where I was the last 10 years before joining AIS, but heavily involved in filings and regulatory compliance there at the NAIC level. While at the NAIC level, my commissioner kind of tagged me to join in a lot of tech and AI initiatives. And just because as a kid I was growing up, I was kind of a nerd. I watched Star Trek 47 times, unfortunately. So I have a lot of I'm not touting to be an AI expert or anything like that, but it does motivate me. It's something that gets me up, that I do enjoy watching the trends of insurance, especially the AI stuff. So that gives you a little bit of background. And like Anthony had alluded to, I've been on the regulatory side. Now I'm on the industry side. So kind of a flip of Mary, where she was on the industry side and now she's on the regulatory side. So hopefully we've got a really good perspective here today. Mary, let me ask you the same questions. What are you seeing on the regulatory side that's making AI? I mean, the NAIC created the H committee, what is it, 4 or 5 years ago now, that is making it such a more of a hot topic. Why? Like that's they created a whole committee just to talk about technology and AI and things like that. Like why is AI so special in the insurance industry from a regulatory perspective?
So I mean, H committee, I think, was created because, Anthony's right in a way that insurance is an industry that is sort of perfect for the use of technology, AI, GLMs, going all the way back to data cards and decision trees, right? We are at our core a very data and document driven industry, and it's a heavy lift. And so, the opportunities for the insurance industry to use, data management tools and AI and so forth to get the job done better, faster, less painfully in some ways with the documentation and so forth is incredibly tempting to our industry. H committee was created because it touches the entire industry, right? The rest of the NAIC committees are based primarily on the type of insurance you're talking about. And AI stretches across all types of insurance. So there needed to be a committee that could sort of look at it holistically. Yes, it's a little different in each type of insurance, how it's used and how much it's used and so forth, but needed some place for it to be looked at holistically. I think it's become a regulatory hot topic because, like any other tool that the industry uses, it's still subject to the same rules. But those rules are a lot more complicated. And trying to piece out how to apply those rules in this new world is not easy. And it's a lot of work. And so I think that's part of the regulatory concern. We need to understand and we need to be able to sort of figure out how to regulate.
Yeah. Anthony, let me ask you this question. Where are you seeing a lot of insurance industry? How are they using AI? Like where is their adoption, like rate? Like if a company comes to you and says, Anthony, I really want to use AI in X reason for my company, where are you seeing the industry kind of focus their efforts?
I think there's a truth that not a lot of AI is getting to production is probably the first thing I would say, which is, even if you look at some analysis from folks like Gartner, some data that says, 27 projects get worked on and one make it to production, right? Like that's definitely representative of what also happens in insurance. There's a lot of excitement about what this can do. But as you start to work through like what's the ROI and what's the benefit and what's the value and or maybe what's the risk, you start to realize that hey, maybe only certain use cases make sense to actually get to production. And in the places where those seem to be happening a little bit more currently is use of AI to help with maybe internal efficiencies, knowledge discovery, certain processes, certain things. It's like they're running the business of insurance inside of our walls. How can we help to be more efficient in running our company? And yes, there's absolutely also a lot of experimentation and or new solutions and tools that might have some predictive data helping with risk assessment of homes or of life insurance, of mortality, or maybe some data that's helping us to identify fraud within claims or create efficiencies within claims. So I'd say across the full value chain, there's interesting AI opportunities that are developing, whether it's from marketing, through claims and or payments and adjudication. But in large part, most of the AI that is being done in the industry is still in sort of the R&D and or internal uses. And maybe in setting up Mary a little bit, I think that's a really important thing that we don't spend any time at Monitaur anymore really telling people like why AI is important. Everybody's got their perspective on AI. They're doing something, right? I think that the opportunity now is very much to create a little bit more of alignment between sort of regulators and carriers in terms of the reality of what's really being done versus the perception of what's being done, right? Because AI is being talked about everywhere, but it's actually not yet materially everywhere inside of insurance companies. So a lot of companies are being very cautious about doing it the right way, right? And really understanding what's expected of them.
Yeah. Mary, Anthony touched about the internal efficiencies, and that's kind of one aspect. From what I've been seeing, regulators are really more concerned about, the consumer-facing applications for AI. The surveys can come out of, the usages in AI. I think the auto survey came out in 2022. The home survey came out in 23. I think the life one came out in 23. And I think we're still waiting for the results for the health insurance one. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
But they really focused on, where is AI being used in claims processing, fraud detection, underwriting, rating, marketing, and loss prevention. So they seem to be really focused on the consumer facing. Can you speak to those surveys a little bit and give us a little bit of what your insights on those results were?
Sure. So yeah, so the auto survey is the oldest. It was 22, I think you're right, that it came out. And we started there because I think we all as regulators knew that the auto industry or the auto insurance industry was a little bit ahead of the game from other types of insurance. So, you know, the P&C market has definitely been more focused on the use of AI than say the life market or the health market. Um, as far as the surveys are concerned, Anthony's right. I mean, we asked questions around, are you using, planning to use, exploring? And then we asked questions about what you are actually using in a variety of categories. And the numbers, went from, are you thinking about it at like sometimes, 50 to 80 or 90% to are you using it? And then it drops to like, in some cases, as low as 20%. So it's definitely a lot of, yeah, we're thinking about it, but we haven't, quite gotten there yet. And Anthony's also right. And the surveys did sort of lay out that the places that seem to be more ripe for the use of it are in areas like claims and fraud detection, marketing, which is obviously the social media networks and Google have had a handle on for years, right? So those places are the places where there's much more uptake, at least in auto, homeowners, and life. The life industry is lagging behind the auto and homeowners industry, but they're picking up speed. The health industry, we're still waiting on the results from the health survey. It closes, I think, at the end of this month. Might be a couple of extensions into February, and then we'll have results. We'll start churning out results, and we're not going to have a report by the spring meeting, but we will have some preliminary results by then. But some of the work we did talking to pilot companies about what the health industry is doing is, they're also going down this path. It's a little bit different in health because you can, it's not just about claims. In some cases, it's about patient management and are there tools they can provide to doctors to help them do their jobs that are AI based. And so it's definitely a little bit different drug management of formularies and things like that. So definitely a little bit more complex in the health industry, and a few more avenues to pursue. I think from a regulatory perspective, the couple of overwhelming things that came out were, one, a need for governance, right? So that the companies, had a plan, understood what they were doing, how they were going to doing, how they're going to test it, how they're going to control all of that work they're doing. And then I also think there's a need just for better documentation. And finally, the real question that gives a lot of regulators heartburn is the third parties. Because we don't regulate a lot of those third parties. We don't have control, which means we're reaching through insurance companies to try to control those relationships because they have impact on consumers. And we worry about consumers first and foremost. Obviously, we're also solvency regulators, so we worry about whether companies are going to stay solvent. And that's a concern here too, because if you make the wrong step in an AI journey and price way off, right, that could have an impact on solvency. But primarily, we worry about consumers.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, and making sure that consumers are protected is why we focus on the consumer-facing things first, and then focus on the others later.
Yeah. So Anthony, Mary brings up some interesting things. She brought up the third-party providers. In my experience, larger insurers are able to sort of create their solutions internally and tailor them to their needs. But a lot of smaller and mid-sized companies really have to rely heavily on those third-party providers. And what you said before is, a lot of them are thinking about doing, they're not quite implementing them. What is the hurdle there? Is it because they don't have the resources to implement an AI? Is it, and careful with this, is because you got a regulator and formula? Is it because regulators aren't really, giving clear guidance, or there's a fear of regulators coming down? What are you seeing from the industry, Anthony, that is really the biggest hurdles to advancing a company's AI journey?
In particular for third party, Chris, right?
Yeah. Focus on the third party if you could. Yeah.
You bet. You know what? I just made note. Mary, a question I get often, something you just said, I'd love to ask that I think the audience would really benefit from. You made this closing comment that's like starting on the things that impact consumers first. But as you look at like the AI, bulletin, and you look at the NIST AI RMF, right? And if I'm a company that's using a lot of AI for internal efficiencies, like there might be certain systems that have a materiality to my business internally, but may not have material like consumer impact. As a regulator, that comment you made, that's like, hey, we're going to start with the things that impact consumers. We sometimes get a question like, hey, do I have to inventory everything I'm doing with AI? Like, is a regulator going to ask me to see everything or only the things that impact consumers? Do you have any opinion on that? And I know you're speaking just for yourself, right? But it's a question I get often that's like, what do I need to do? Do I need to inventory everything or just the things that impact consumers?
So I wouldn't say just the things that impact consumers. And it is me speaking. I'm not sure it requires you to inventory everything. I mean, if you've got an AI model that calculates how many people are using your company cafeteria, I really don't care.
But bulletin uses language commensurate with risk, right? So the bulletin
commensurate with risk, and sometimes those back office efficiencies can ultimately lead to back office problems, which can impact solvency, can impact risk. So I don't want to say you only have to worry about the consumer-facing things, but as regulators, those are the things that we're going to clamp down on first.
Yeah.
Those things and the things that are going to affect financials. Um, because we can't do everything at once. So we are also risk focused and prioritizing based on risk where we want to focus our attention.
Thanks. And Chris, thanks for letting me just ask that follow-up, because
Mhm.
the way that she said that, I get that question all the time. And it feels like a good segue into the third party, which is, in the way that you asked the question, I think that sometimes there is this perception of third party dependency or leverage with a big carrier versus a smaller entity is very different. And there are some differences, but I think this entire industry runs on a lot of third party information,
Mhm.
right? Like, a lot of back office or like core platforms or data intelligence, right? Like, it's everywhere, right? It's pervasive. And I think that one of the muscles that is being learned around third party is that we already do a lot of third party risk management, right? And no matter whether you're a big or small carrier, you already ask third party certain critical questions to do business with them, right? Like, what is your corporate responsibilities? What are your privacy practices? What are your security practices, right? Like, there's certain things that you won't do business with someone unless they have certain good practices. And I think what I'm seeing happening with our customers, and both on the vendor and on the sort of carrier side, whether you're big or small, there's an understanding that's starting to happen. It's like, if you're using AI in the delivery of service, I need to know something about that, right? I don't need to know your IP, or I don't need to see your code, but I do need to know that if you're going to use AI in a delivery of service to me, do you have good data governance practices? Do you have good AI risk management practices? Do you test your system, right? I'm seeing risk transference happening, whether you're a mid-market carrier or a large carrier. You're including in your vendor contracts that the vendor acknowledges they're aware that you are responsible to conform with an AI bulletin, and therefore, Mr. and Mrs. Vendor, I need you to share in that responsibility. So I think it's early, Chris, but I am seeing both the vendor side and the carrier side recognizing I need to demonstrate that I have some good model risk management practices. It's quickly becoming somewhat table stakes on your ability to do business. And I think the huge platforms like, OpenAI or the things coming from Google or Microsoft, those companies are providing pretty robust documentation around the systems that they're offering. And then the customer of those systems now needs to solve, how do I build more use case specific governance? Because, Mary is unlikely to come to you and say, like, how did you evaluate Microsoft or Google? But they might say you're using their system to be trained to help automate claims or evolve your marketing. How did you build good governance around that use case? Right. And so I think that a lot of folks, I would say 18 months ago, were really concerned that no vendor is going to tell me anything about their AI. I don't think that that's true. I'm seeing people asking questions and vendors are asking. I'm seeing the big vendors proactively giving more. And we just need to be patient, is my sort of opinion here, that over time we will see the people building AI, the people buying AI, the people tuning AI for their use case. Everyone, I think, is starting to normalize around there's a certain level of responsibility and documentation that needs to happen. And you can't do business if you don't do that. So I'd say that's sort of my observation. I know there was a lot of worry that only the big carriers have leverage to make a vendor do something. I'm actually not seeing that play out. I'm seeing both sides recognizing they can get info. And I think, Mary, on a panel you and I did not long ago, even in your survey and discussions with pilot companies, I think you were seeing some similar things in terms of, that exchange of key information to help with good governance is happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's happening. I think, unfortunately, some people are still using it as a crutch. Where we hear, oh, but we're small and we can't get that information. And it's not true. I mean, we have at the NAIC has, Microsoft and Google coming to them and volunteering to present, volunteering to share information to help us build regulation. So it's not anymore a matter of leverage. It was in the very beginning because there was trade secrets and it's confidential and it's the black box, but I think we're past that point. And I think everybody needs to just, there is one overriding sort of tenet that everybody needs to remember, and that is if you outsource, you can outsource a process, but you cannot outsource responsibility.
Um, since it was brought up, the elephant in the room, let's talk about it. The AI Bulletin passed, it was a year ago now? Is that
Yep,
about right?
outright.
Yeah. So, Mary, I was wondering if you could talk specifically. We have a question in the Q&A. Do GLM models qualify under machine learning on the definition for the AI bulletin? But if you could answer that question in a larger scale scope of like, what is the AI bulletin trying to accomplish for the industry insurance industry out there? What is it trying to protect? I think you've kind of alluded to before as your number one goal is to protect the consumer. Maybe you can do a deeper dive into the AI bulletin. To give a background, I think we just talked about this. The AI bulletin has been passed now in 20 states with five kind of offshooting from that, I guess, but still kind of the same overall arching goal. I was wondering if you could talk about that real quick.
Sure. So I don't, I am not, I don't think going to get into the nitty-gritty of what's covered and what's not. The whole point of the AI bulletin is it's a bulletin. It's not yet, it's not a statute, right? We started with well, if we back up, right? We started with AI principles, which were just guiding principles for how we should be thinking about the use of AI. And unfortunately, the definition of AI can be narrow or it can be broad, and depending on the circumstance that you're looking at it in. I think the point of moving from the principles to the bulletin was to get more specificity about what regulators' expectations are. I can say truthfully, that's not going to be the end of the analysis, right? We're not going to stop with the bulletin. At this point, I think that the real question is, what do we need beyond the bulletin and what we already have for regulation? Because the bulletin points out that we already have regulation that applies, right? There's insurance trade practices rules and claims practices rules and corporate governance and so forth that govern how the industry does business. And that applies to AI. Pricing has to be, fair and reasonable and can't be unfairly discriminatory. That still applies if you're using a model to calculate your pricing or if you're doing it on a piece of paper. So we've gotten to the point with the bulletin of sort of explaining how we think about AI in the context of the existing rules and what we think the expectations might be. But I suspect it's going to go farther. We know that there are states that have proposed and I think in some cases passed statutes relating to AI governance generally, not specific to insurance. Legislators are asking these questions and are moving this forward. The insurance industry is going to have to think about how they want to sort of manage that because insurance is different. You talk to legislators in the context of, say, privacy and data security, and the immediate thing is it can't be discriminatory. Well, the insurance industry is all about discrimination. What we do is discriminate, right? We calculate rates based on fair discrimination, but we discriminate between people. And so that knee-jerk from a legislative perspective isn't what we need for our industry. And so as good regulators, as a good body of regulators, the NAIC needs to figure out how to move that forward. So the bulletin's there to sort of draw the roadmap around expectations based on the statutory framework we have today, and to sort of take what we used on a spreadsheet underwriting calculation and apply it to AI. But now we move forward to figure out how to tweak those regulations to make them more applicable in a different world. And maybe we don't need to change a lot. Unfair discrimination is unfair discrimination, regardless of how it happens. But there may be statutes, regulations, models that don't quite fit in this world. And that's, I think, the next thing that we're tackling. And one of those things relates to third-party data, third-party models, because we don't have a good handle on how we sort of wrap that in from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah. I want to touch on something you touched on before. I always saw the bulletin as a continuation of the AI principles that we set out
Yep.
back in 2019. And for those who are unfamiliar, we used the acronym FACTS, the our AI FACTS. So make sure that an AI system is fair, make sure that the AI system is accountable. I always like to go to a former commissioner of mine. Always would say, are you okay explaining this AI system to your neighbor? Are you okay explaining it to your mother? Are you okay explaining it to the commissioner of the state? If all three answers are good, then you're being accountable for your actions. Make sure that they're being compliant. Make sure you're being transparent in those, and then making sure they're secure. And they touched on data privacy. So yeah, I think the AI bulletin is catching up speed, and I would just reiterate everything you just said there, Mary. I do want to shift a little bit there. We talked about it's been passed in 20 states. There's about 5 states who have kind of gone on their own, I guess. Colorado, New York, Texas, and California. Anthony, as Monitor, how are you struggling to compare those two? Like there's an AI bulletin out there, and then there's some states who are doing their own thing, I guess. What is the struggles to making sure that companies are compliant that way?
Yeah, I laugh thinking about the commercial that I stayed at Holiday Inn Express last night. Like, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a compliance expert, right? And I'll connect it to the last question too, Chris. And there was a question about, like, do GLM models qualify under the definition, right? I think if I zoom out, what I've generally seen is I think AI as a topic created a bit of a a focus more generally on modeling practices is what I feel I've heard in discussions, both public and private, right? It's that there's some conflating things that are happening here. There's the buzzword of AI. There's concerns around like ecdis and non-traditional data that are impacting the industry. And then there's where does the line of what data are you using that's non-traditional to impact insurance, and what modeling technique are you using? And within that, I do think that absolutely, like, GLM stuff can fall into the space, because maybe it falls into the space because you've got some non-traditional data, and now you've got to think about, is there a disparate impact that you can maybe prove or not prove is appropriate, versus it might not be a more complex modeling technique. And so, like, one of the things that, as when you were at the state, and we worked with the H committee and tried to sort of, like, publicly provide feedback and in working on this issue, the thing that the bulletin does, and also the NIST AI RMF does, is it tries to basically enable companies with a way to think about, no matter the type of system, models follow a certain repeatable structure, and you can have a common way to do risk management that is good practice. Even if there wasn't regulation, as I think about using models or new data to make decisions, I should have a way that I think about that, right? I should identify what the use case and opportunity is. I should know what data I'm using. I should be able to verify that this is a good model. And once it's actually out there in the wild, is it doing what I think it would do? So if you sort of, like, take all of these complexities and really break them down to the most basic, sort of tenets or elements, whether it's New York Circular 7, whether it's SB 169 in Colorado, whether it's the AI Bulletin, what we see at Monitaur and we help our customers do, but what I think a lot of people see is a consistency of saying, hey, if you're going to use models to make decisions within your business, if you're going to use non-traditional data to inform decisions about your business, have some consistent structure for knowing that it's happening, proving that you evaluated its appropriateness, and that you're keeping an eye on it, right? And I think that that's the kind of approach every company should try to take, is to almost annoyingly simplify this as, do we know all of the places we're using non-traditional data? Do we have a place where we understand all the places we might be using more complex modeling systems? And for the places that non-traditional data or models are having a greater impact, i.e. higher risk, do we have a greater degree of governance and oversight in testing on those things? Right? I think those are sort of like the key components. And, I think Circular 7 talks about that, right? SB 169, the first thing that made it through is the risk management framework, not the testing, right? And the bulletin is focused on the risk management framework. And by design, it's a laddering problem. I think the risk management framework gives you the laddering, which then, for higher risk or higher consequence, you expect maybe more testing or more validation
Mhm.
or more proof of there not being bias. And so to me, those are really helpful, sort of ways to think about this problem without maybe getting, yes, there's some nuance around how Circular 7 specifically names fairness and bias testing techniques, right? Colorado didn't quite that there, and the bulletin doesn't mention it at all, right? So of course, you need to think about those, and Monitaur, part of our focus is to take all of these different pieces and pull it into one common approach. But in general, I think the 2025 priority for every insurance company, establish your AI risk management program, right? Generally, I believe, and Mary, correct me if you really feel strongly, otherwise, I think if you do that in 2025, the degree to which you have robust testing, validation, and continuous monitoring on the high risk things, like I think people recognize that might take a little bit more time to do that. But this is the year where like you better have a program defined and policies and inventory and understanding of what you're doing. And then you can start to invest more in managing greater risks, in the out years. So that's just my view as I, try to, again, not an attorney, not a compliance expert, try to interpret and sort of steer how all these different parts connect.
I do want to allude to something. Somebody must have been listening to our earlier conversation because we got a question in the chat. How does the regulatory environment changing with the repeal of Biden's AI executive order 14110? Well, how that will affect things going forward, and will NIST still be the guiding framework? I know we talked about this before we jumped on the call. Mary, do you want to take a stab at that one?
So I'll leave the NIST question aside because I'm not sure we have any idea how this is going to affect NIST, right? But I will say, insurance has always been state-based regulation, right? I think the repeal tells us that it's become more important that this is state-based regulation. We're not going to get anything from the federal government, and it will be key. It's even more important for state regulators to focus on that because we are where the buck stops now, at least for the next 4 years. So I think you'll see, at least from our perspective, more focus on those things that we do have control over, and that we have where the responsibility is sitting squarely on our shoulders, like AI, now that the federal government has pulled back from that. So I think it only makes it more important, the work we're doing, as opposed to, causing any consternation from a regulatory perspective.
You know what, Chris, we spent some time with the NIST team, with Riva and her group as the AI RMF was developed and then pushed live. I think it's a great question. I think the industry would benefit if there continues to be investment in sort of like research institutions, helping companies and helping industry understand what good might look like. I think in its current form, like if you're an insurance company or you're a company that's building or buying AI, you might not be an expert at what does building a good modeling system look like? What does good testing look like? What does good like governance look like? And so even if its current form, if no more investment happens in this, the current AI RMF, our opinion at Monitaur, provides some really great framework that you can use today, even if it isn't further advanced. Now, what's missing with like the bulletin or with the NIST AI RMF or even with the AAIS Act is like that next level down of exactly what do you do to prove that you have good data validation? Like, what do you tell your data scientist or your data engineer to do practically? Monitaur tries to insert at that level, like, hey, NIST says this, now what does it really mean, right? Or the bulletin says this, what does it really mean? Circular 7 says this. So I love the question, and I would definitely encourage folks to, if your company has already decided that the NIST AI RMF is going to be a good standard that you're aligned with, I think the current form of that is still highly leverageable. Because within your company, you might not have the expertise of what a good comprehensive risk management program could be, right? So the bulletin and NIST RMF, I think, work together really well. And if you're in 2025 figuring out, like, what do I point my good towards? I think those still offer really great guidance and framework that you can build a program around today.
And I think from a regulatory perspective, I think Anthony's right. It's a good framework. We're, at least I'm looking for you to have a reasoned, thought out framework for how you're working on things, right? Do you have a process? Do you document that process? Is that process reasonable? Does it make sense for your business and for the models that you're using? I don't know that I'm tied to any particular, you know, framework, or if there's something about the NIST framework that doesn't make sense in a particular insurer's business, then they should modify it to what makes sense for the risk that they're facing. Now, if they do something completely crazy and throw it out the window and say, we don't need this stuff, then obviously as a regulator, we're going to take offense to that. But this is the AI Bulletin has principles in it, just like the original AI principles. We didn't want to be at a point where we were saying you must do A, B, and C, because every insurer is different, and the types of insurance they sell, how they sell it, how they model, price, underwrite, it's different in every place, which means there has to be some flexibility to fit the governance framework to what you are doing.
You know, Mary, maybe as an example, like a really tactical one that is something we talk about. The bulletin talks about there should be an AI governance committee. It doesn't say how often it has to meet. It doesn't, it's not explicitly like what exactly is the explicit scope of responsibilities of this vis-a-vis your enterprise risk management group, or maybe some other sort of committee, right? And I think that's maybe a good example of like, hey, if you're an insurance in the United States and you're going to build a policy and you're going to build a governance program, the bulletin offers almost a checklist of these are the kinds of things that a regulator might be expecting that your program includes or considers. But exactly how you do some of those things, there's latitude there, right, in terms of like the frequency or the veracity, specificity. And I think something you said really resonates with me, how one company's corporate risk posture could be very different from another's, right? And so within their AI RMF policy, it's important that I think it's explaining to you as a regulator, what is their sort of general posture on this, and therefore their program is tuned to their company. Does that all feel right to you?
It does, and it's kind of ironic, right? Insurance is a risk management business, and yet we're really having a hard time figuring out how to create a governance framework for risk management of AI. So, I mean, we have the tools, right? We are an industry that is an expert at risk management. We just need to figure out how to apply it in this particular scenario.
Oh, Anthony, this is a quick question that we have in the chat. What does NIST stand for? Do we know that acronym off the top of my? I know what they do. Can look it up real quick.
Yeah, you know what? I was actually just going to, I don't know if the
N-
page is down. It's not.
yeah,
I'm going to go ahead
it's
and share into the chat. This is the National Institute of Science and Technology, and the NIST AI RMF is the AI Risk Management Framework. I'm going to share into the chat a link for everybody that offers the sort of the landing page of the NIST information.
yeah.
So I just
I
dropped that in.
I think when we created the AI principles, we used NIST as a almost a starting point for those and kind of try to tailor those towards the insurance industry. You guys have alluded to this question already, but I do want to make sure that we do touch on it because it's important. So you guys talked about, like having some kind of corporate governance and things like that. But if a company says, I really want to dive into AI for 2025, but I want to make sure I'm doing it right. Anthony, what would be your advice for like practical steps that an
Yeah.
insurer could take to make sure they're meeting the expectations? Like, what's a year one roadmap for them, kind of thing?
Yeah, and you know what? One quick addition to the last point. We're in insurance. Your company can absolutely look at actuarial standards of practice as a great model for good AI governance as well. So, one of the things that is unique about insurance is we have actuaries and actuarial practice, from how they identify opportunities, evaluate data through like looking at outcomes and results like ASOPs. And one of the things we do at Monitaur is actually align the bulletin with NIST and with ASOPs. Because if I'm an insurance company, wouldn't it be nice if I could harmonize my actuarial practices with my data science practices? So one other thing that I just want to challenge folks to consider is you have actuaries in your four walls. They've spent a lot of time learning what good model building looks like. A lot of that can be leveraged as you move into the AI journey as well. So Chris, what do you do the first 12 months? Listen, 2023 December, not a single state had adopted any AI posture. 2024 December, we're at 25, as you said earlier, 20 with the bulletin and then 5 others. And, I think without being explicit, I've heard, New York say things like, hey, give or take a year from when the circular happened, we'll start asking questions, which means like, middle of 2025, if you've got exposure or relationship with New York DFS, they might start asking. They haven't been explicit, about that. And so we back up, we're in January, what do I do now? The first step is in governance, maybe building on Mary's comment, you have to define what your approach is. So you need to establish an internal policy that establishes your posture, right? And that policy should define what is AI, what are the roles and responsibilities, like very much look at the bulletin, and those are almost like, it's almost an outline of like, these are the things that my policy should have an opinion on. And you sort of map out, all right, this is what AI is, these are the roles and responsibilities, this is how we do risk segmentation, this is how we will inventory. But you don't want to be so explicit that you can't actually enforce or verify that you're doing those things. That's where then your procedures and your controls come into place. So in 2025, I think the challenge would be finalize a policy, establish an inventory so that you know what your universe looks like, apply the risk stratification from your policy against that inventory, and spend your energy in 2025 with, do I have my governance applied to my highest risk use cases, right? And it might be consumer impact, it might be financial, to Mary's point, it might be fiduciary impact. Like it could this system might have a great impact on consumers, but it might have a huge impact on my reserves or my solvency, as an example. And some of that stuff I think is already, you could argue, might already be regulated because of solvency type percent, right? But that's what I would say next 12 months. If you don't have a clear policy, establish one, right? Then create some guidance for your employees on how to conform with the policy, and then start to create your inventory and understand what your risk portfolio looks like. And that inventory cannot just be your internal stuff, to Mary's point. You also need to now be able to understand, of all the vendors I work with, which of those use cases need to be a part of my inventory. A really simple question everyone on the call could include in their vendor relationships: are you using AI in the delivery of service, right? So like, Mary, I don't think you guys are interested in fourth party oversight where maybe a vendor's using some AI in their own internal HR practices. What you're really interested in, are they using in delivery of service to the carrier, right? In that straight line. So those would be the things. Maybe I rambled a bit, Chris, but finalize policy, create some procedural guidance of how employees can conform with policy, create some inventory, and then use the risk categories from your policy, assign risk to what you're doing. I believe if everybody focuses on that this year, then you can start to think about how to scale governance, how to scale fairness or monitoring or testing. That would be my advice for 2025.
Mary, let me ask you this question. Is one of the biggest fears from the industry side is the regulator comes knocking at their door and say, hey, explain this AI system. What Anthony just laid out, is that from a regulatory perspective, would that be a satisfactory answer? Are you guys looking for more than that? What can we do to alleviate the industry side? Because I don't believe there's any type of regulator out there who's like, yeah, we want to get company because they're using AI. You just want to make sure it's being done responsible. But it's the fear of the unknown. How can we alleviate that for the industry kind of thing?
So definitely having a governance framework helps. I will add to Anthony's comments, an upfront thing that before you do anything that Anthony is talking about is to get the right people in the room to have that conversation. You cannot let the data scientists build the governance structure. You also can't let the lawyers build the governance structure. You need all the people in the room to build the governance structure so that it makes sense. I'm a lawyer. I can't build a data science governance structure by myself. But The data scientists can't either because they know nothing about insurance law. So, I mean, that's step one. You need the right people in that room to build a practical governance structure. As far as what we're expecting, I mean, I think from Vermont's perspective, from my perspective, right? I'm going to expect that you've done something and that what you've done makes some sense. We're not going to expect perfect at this point. Everybody's still figuring this out. Um, but I think we are never going to want you to tell us, if I ask you about a particular model, well, we don't know how that works, that the vendor does that, and so we don't really know how that works. That's never the right answer. Now, am I going to want to sit down and read the code? No. I'm going to want to know that you can explain to me what it does, that you monitor what it does, that you understand the risk that it raises, and that you test it to make sure it's still doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it's doing it fairly in a non-discriminate, unfairly, that it's not unfairly discriminatory. I don't think there's any regulator, maybe a regulator like California that has a million people working for them, that's literally going to go in there and read code. It's just not something that we can do. We are going to expect that you can show us, and tell us what it does, how it does it in an explainable manner, not in code. And it shows that you think it's working, that you have some process for making sure it doesn't break down and stop working the right way. That I think that's what we're going to be looking for. I mean, human beings make mistakes, and we've been regulating human beings for years. We expected before underwriters did anything other than looking at documents, we would expect there's a supervisor somewhere checking their work. This is the same thing. Somebody needs to understand what their process is and to be checking the work.
You know what, Mary? Something you just said, there's organizational posture on this, and then there's the system level governance, right? And I think something you're saying is like, you want to see those connected, right? So if I have a corporate policy at an AAIS level, at a system level, how have you affected that policy, right? And I think that's a unique, interesting thing here, because in insurance, we have model filings, and then we have sort of the enterprise risk or fiduciary assessment, right? We've now taken that same thing and brought it into just this world where it's like, tell me about your corporate AI governance approach, and now be able to demonstrate that on a use case level, right? And I think in that, there's an opportunity that's like, hey, Mary, here is my claims automation model governance summary, right? This is here's the things that I've done on this project to affect governance. And maybe that's telling you a story, and maybe you'll only probe deeper if there's a consumer complaint or an issue, right? I think that first step is maybe the opportunity for folks is like hey, I told you about my corporate policy. Here are some examples of that policy live on a AI system level. And then if you have issues or you have complaints, then I think is where you start to maybe probe more around, look under the hood a little bit more.
Yep.
I don't know if that resonates, but I feel like to me, that seems like a logical sort of way to think through this for companies.
Listen, regulators don't have unlimited resources either. So we approach regulating the same way that we're talking about approaching this, right? We do it on a risk basis. So we're going to look at the high level. We're going to dig a little deeper if we want more information. And then if we see a problem, we're going to dig even deeper. It's the same thing. And I'm not going to dig deeper on the cafeteria algorithm, but I might dig deeper on the claims algorithm that could be, profiling people. So, I mean, we're going to look at it from a risk perspective the same way that the entire insurance industry looks at everything from a risk perspective. It doesn't mean you can ignore things that are low risk, but, devote your resources to the things that are going to have the most impact first.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, we got a question in the chat. I'm going to give this to you, and I know I told you not to speak this as a sales pitchy, but this question does involve Monitaur. What are there resources for AI governance frameworks that you would recommend? Obviously, we invited Monitaur here for a reason today. They would be top one. Maybe if you want to give a quick 5-minute overview of what Monitaur does, Anthony, that'd probably be helpful for our audience.
Yeah, listen, let me zoom out first, which is like, I'll reinforce something earlier. Like, I do think the NIST AI RMF offers some helpful acceleration of learning and perspective on this, right? In the define, manage, map, sort of that journey can be helpful. I think the AI Bulletin can be helpful. I think actuarial standards of practice can be helpful, right? So I think there's some great horizontal agnostic standards that people can use. I think part of the reason we started the company, and my co-founder who, built a lot of the machine learning audit and assurance at Capital One, the opinion was it's hard to operationalize or execute high-level policies. Like Mary's comment earlier, don't let the attorney just build a policy. Well, the attorney doesn't know what good model building look like, and the model builder might not know what a good policy looks like, right? And I think that, Monitaur as a company tries to really live at that level of helping our clients, like, by licensing templates for policies and controls and then software to help operationalize. What we're really just trying to do is bring some expertise and experience. I guess those are sort of the same, but into a client to say, hey, listen, like, here is an example of a policy that, of course, you're going to fit for your own purpose, but it aligns with the kind of standards and regulations you need to align with because you're an insurance company, right? So it's pre-positioned or built for insurance. And then you've got controls that align with ASOPs. And then you've got an inventory system that can connect with your actuaries or your data scientists and your data engineers. So I think that, sure, selfishly, I'd like to think that Monitaur really uniquely has the ability to help a client go from I don't have any policy to I don't have a policy and controls and inventory in a faster cycle and in a really robust way, than you would otherwise. But it doesn't mean that we're the only solution. There's definitely good standards out there like, NIST that people can. There's a lot of smart people on this call that can read and interpret and intuit how to implement something, that's out there. Using Mary's point, if you put the right people around the table. I think the question is, how much time, effort, and energy do you want to put into it? So I'd like to think, and thanks, Chris, for the offer. I think Monitaur is really uniquely built, like an insurance-tuned, comprehensive AI governance solution that can help with everything from build your policy, establish the procedures and controls, train your people, cause an inventory, and then create proof of governance against your consequential models, right? That full sort of spectrum, but crawl, walk, run, right? Policies first. Thanks for giving me a chance, but I'm always
Yeah.
uncomfortable doing it. This has been a great
Fair
call.
enough.
Sharing
Yeah.
thoughts.
So with that, we're almost at time. Mary, any final words that you want to tell our audience about AI governance in general?
So I will tell the audience the same thing I tell them about anything from a regulatory perspective. Open communication is the best way to solve these problems, right? We, at least in Vermont, welcome phone calls, emails, ask us questions. I am very much happy to help hear your question and, help you work through, okay, maybe you can't do X, but if we change this, maybe you can do Y. And maybe that's the corporate attorney in me from my prior life because, corporations don't like their lawyers to say no. Um, but that's the approach we try to take. I would much rather have you come to me and ask the question. I will absolutely hate the better to ask for forgiveness than permission conversation that we have to have later. That's not a conversation you have with me. That's a conversation with you have with our head of market conduct. Um, so, we need an open line of communication between the industry and individual regulators, between the industry and the NAIC, and between regulators and regulators, because we have to learn from each other. We don't have unlimited resources. We are state employees. We can't go out and just buy the greatest tech either. So we need to learn from the industry. The industry needs to learn what our expectations are, and then we need to rely on each other to help get through this. So call us.
That sounds great. Anthony, any final words that you'd like to share?
No, listen, I love these opportunities. If anybody that's here just wants to sort of like talk about this problem, I think trying to be a good student, insurance is complex. And we've spent 5 years building our company, and I think every day I learn something new. So thanks for the opportunity, Chris, to sort of offer. I think Monitaur knows certain things, and I know certain things, but even every time I get to spend time with Mary or a regulator or somebody in industry, we learn a little bit more. So I'll take Mary's prompt and sort of expand that. Just talking to folks, if anyone has some questions or thoughts or opinions on this, I'd love to have a chance to just discuss what's hard or what's easy or how to approach this. This whole industry is working on this problem together. And I think that that's what's been also great about the NAIC approach. Like, let's talk about this. Let's be transparent about what's working and not working, and let's find, a successful outcome. But thanks for the opportunity to be on this, Chris.
No, well, thank you, and thanks everybody for joining us today on this webinar. Mary, especially, and Mary, Anthony, especially, thank you. This has been a great conversation, I think. If anybody missed part of this conversation or discussion and want to replay it, it will be available on an on-demand video on AAIS's YouTube channel in the next coming weeks. We're also going to be sending up a follow-up email to your contact information. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. And any questions we didn't get to today, please reach out. Lastly, before I close the conversation, I do want to put a shameless plug in for our AAIS main event, which will be April 6th through the 8th. If you enjoyed this conversation today, the main event will be focusing around AI opportunities and engagement and regulatory. We do have another panel that does a deeper dive into Monitaur, and we do have a regulatory panel that does some commissioners on that panel as well. So I encourage anybody who's interested in this topic or AI in general to please reach out on our website for that event details, or feel free to reach out to one of our member engagement teams if you have any questions. But with that, appreciate everybody's time and have a great afternoon.